Now. Cool. Yeah, that way this will be a recording explaining walking through the whole Archivers app. Gosh, the records thing makes me so nervous. But yeah, so how are you feeling?
Oh, hey. Not too bad. Yeah, I just discovered the in Chrome debugger for the server.
Nice. Yeah,
that's fun. Yeah, I mean, it's, the sort of the front end, just kind of use some JavaScript to pull some markup together. That stuff makes sense. Your sort of API calls for, for adding and removing stuff, more or less makes sense. I haven't worked with Mongo before, but, I understand the sort of, JSON-based database. So for kind of like data cleanup tasks, sort of, running a query to kind of find everything, so that we can make a list and that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
Dig into that.
Totally.
And I know that there's some cleanup stuff, kind of in the queue, related to, issues that URLs that may not have gotten checked and whatnot. So that's
that's getting big. But first, let's say hi, John.
I'm at a place, unfortunately, I can't talk either loudly or too much, so I...
Totally fine.
yeah, unfortunately, but hey.
Before we get started, do you have access to the repo? I don't know. I can't remember.
No, I don't.
Okay. So I'm going to... And where are you at in terms of dev? You're a solid dev, if I remember correctly, right?
Say that again?
Are you familiar with working on front-end dev projects?
I have some experience. I know JavaScript fairly well. I know Node fairly well.
Cool.
I don't have a huge amount of experience with projects, but I have a decent techno background, and I think I can onboard pretty quickly.
Perfect. Okay, cool. So
I know the basics of like Angular or whatever. What are you using? Meteor.
It's Meteor and React. Yeah.
Okay, I think I can pick it up quickly though.
Cool. So let's get you invited to the repo, and then if you end up being like, I don't want to contribute to this, then you don't have to. We'll
as much as I can.
I'll get you an invite right now. As we mentioned before, the hope is to open this up relatively soon, but for now we're closed still, which is something we really got to rectify. But yeah. Collaborators. Okay, and what's your GitHub handle?
So it's exactly the same, I think, as my username here.
Black.
Yeah, it is exactly the same.
John Ganc. Cool. Make sure I spelled that right, so I don't invite some stranger. Okay. So I'm going to copy the URL, invite you into this chat, and then we'll get moving. So yeah, take a second to sort of find that, but I'm going to share my screen and just walk through a bunch of the code base today. So feel free to, either of you feel free to stop me at any point. We can sort of do this kind of, hopefully we'll just do this in like 25 minutes and be able to sort of like get a good overview. Does that sound good, John?
Yeah, sounds great. Should I clone the repo real fast? Or?
Yeah, go for it if you want.
Do that.
Yeah, that way you can follow along. That's probably a good idea. Yeah, and while we wait for that, Kevin, the ESLint thing, awesome. Such a smart move.
Good. Yeah.
The code convention is silly smart. Yeah, particularly I was telling you, coming from GoFumps land where like when we write Go, like everything just has to be the exact like Go.
Oh, right.
And so it's really nice to have that applied even in JS land.
Yeah, I've always been a stickler, kind of coder, but having something that just sort of, does that checking for you as you go, and will also, just sort of let you remember different syntax conventions for different projects. Because Drupal has a set of JavaScript rules, and they want a space between the function name and the parentheses, and Word doesn't. And so just having the editor just tell me, yeah.
Well, and it'll already clean up an issue where like Dan's editor was adding some like crazy line break thing that made GitHub really angry. That's what's producing all that red in our commits.
Yeah,
so,
totally.
And it'll cure my tab addiction. I'm a big tabs guy, but you know.
Yeah.
So I got it up.
Cool. Okay, so I'll share my screen. We'll get started. Make sure that this is okay. Where am I? Pipeline project. Can you guys see this okay?
Yeah.
Let's get some code up and see if that's big enough. Is that visible, or should I make the code bigger?
No, that's fine.
I can see it fine.
Cool. So let's start. So top level folder, just so that we can get a feel here. We've got your client imports. Tom, would you mind muting your mic while you're not talking? That way, there's just a little rustling noise.
There it is.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so we've got a couple of things. Client imports, node modules, obviously private and server. Just to give you a really quick overview of all this stuff. Private is stuff that does not get exposed anywhere for the actual server use. So this is where we have our import and export scripts for getting stuff into and out of the DB. Kevin's added these wonderful contributing guidelines, or readmes all here, whatever. Our server stuff is, so all the code in this code base is, because we're using Meteor, everything gets, a lot of files get run on both the client side and the server side. And so that's a huge thing to sort of get used to. It used to be called isomorphic JavaScript, and now it's referred to as universal JavaScript. You know, whatever terminology.
Yeah, I remember trying to spend a little while trying to figure out what the hell that meant. But yeah, I know what you mean.
It's just JS that runs in two places. And so, yeah, server code is obviously just only ever going to run on the server. And so this is sort of the main, if you're used to thinking in the traditional server client model, and you want to start by understanding the server, this is the best place to start. This is sort of where we do all of our imports of like our APIs folder, which we'll show you in a sec, but like this is like where everything boots from. And your first run of this client or of this code base, when you start, like with when you don't have any Mongo instances, this thing automatically creates the root user, which is this function, and a whole bunch of stuff. And so like the first time you spin this thing up, it creates a root user and just logs out the actual username and password and expects that you'll change that for the root user on your local machine. So if you can get that up and running, awesome. Oh, we should lint this too. So as I was saying to Kevin, we're in the process of linting everything. So like I think currently this is done with, this is spaces, cool. But we're going to try and sort of observe the code conventions of linting that are in the package.json. We should probably get a README written up on how to set up your linter, but that can be a long-term thing. Okay, cool. So moving on, we've got client imports. So the client.
Is there, by the way, is there a particular linter? Is it ESL?
ESLint with the Babel. So all of this, all the code that you'll see is being written with ES 2015 syntax. Or is that what it is? Yeah, that's the 2015 spec. And so, yeah, this thing that I'm showing you right now actually has the ESLint config, and this is included in the project. And so you can.
Yeah, it'll all come down with Node. The only trick is just whatever editor you're using, integrated.
Yeah, I had a bit of a pain setting it up. I actually had to like edit my my user settings for this ESLint thing, and I ended up just cheating and like pointing it directly at my.
Yeah, I mean, whatever works.
Yeah, it went off without a hitch. I did make one addition, Kevin, to your configuration. Which one was it? It was the no bitwise flag. I use bitwise operators because sometimes we do stuff on the really efficient way. That's the only thing I changed. Cool. So getting back to the overview, the client folder.
I have a quick question. So
yeah,
I'm very happy to listen to you guys talk to us, but are there, like, you gave people very short notice. I wonder if there might have been some other people who might have wanted to
totally. I should have mentioned this, John. We're recording this. So we will be I'll post this up once it's done, and we'll definitely make it so that everyone can see it. Yeah. And yes, this was very short notice because this is something that Kevin and I have been meaning to do for a while, and we will obviously want to just have our meetings in the open, but we didn't really sort of take a lot of time to plan this.
It just occurred to me.
Yeah, no, it's a great call. And so, yeah, that's why we're recording it. I apologize everybody who's watching this recording and watching us debate all this. But yeah, so yeah, moving on, if you don't mind. we're going to go to the client folder. Client is where just stuff that only loads on the client side. So this is where all of our style sheets get dragged in. So we have this SCSS folder, which all gets auto-magically compiled down. I'm actually not completely sure how that works, but I don't care at this point. And this also contains our main HTML, which is quite empty, as you can see, because we populate everything from the app. And then main is the actual sort of init function that gets called on the client side. So really all we do in this folder, and this is a great place to kick off, is we pull in our routes. We use React Router to do our routing. And then we just call render, which looks at this root element in the main, which is called app. And we find that element, and then we just populate that with our React app. So it's pretty straightforward, I think. That should be fixed. I'm cleaning that up. Yeah, so that's the client folder. Lots, if you have to edit style sheets, it's always in there. And then a lot of the real action happens in this imports folder. It's labeled imports because it's imported on both the client and the server. And this sort of subset or subdirectory is actually fairly important. So we'll go through all of these one at a time. All of the model layer stuff that you would traditionally think of in an MVC app is in the API folder. This is where we define all of our models, where we define all of our methods on models. And this is sort of like how, everything gets set up. I'll dive into one of those files in a second. But libs is where I've had to sort of jam a couple of higher level libraries that weren't written using the import syntax into this libs folder. Eventually, I'd like to see this folder actually go away. But for now, we're using it in place of like proper imports for a few like things that have just needed to get into the code base, namely this normalized URL and S3 upload functions, both of which I'd written in other places and just needed to get in. So one day we'll delete the libs folder and we'll have one less folder to worry about. Startup is a folder to just gets loaded on startup. Sort of configures a couple of packages and sets up default stuff. Most importantly, we have this client routes folder or file, which is where our actual, you can see the actual routing layer here. This is where we do all of our URL stuff. So this defines sort of all of the routes for the app, and that's actually how the app interprets everything because it loads on the client side. And then this folder is obviously one of the biggest ones. This is all of our React UI. So we split up between components and containers, which I'll explain. And we also have a selectors folder, which actually should probably be elevated to the imports directory. But I'll end up walking through this components and containers in detail once we talk about the UI. But first, I want to go back to the API stuff. Is this feeling too fast, too slow? How are you guys doing this so far?
Good with me.
Okay. And if I have to, I can look at it again anyway, right?
Totally. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to use an example. Let's use agencies. No, let's use URLs as an example. Make sure that my syntax is set to Babel. And so this is a classic, like URLs is obviously in our, inside our app. Our URL is a representation of a URL for harvesting. And so this is all of the stuff that defines how to work on and with a URL. We see this Meteor publish stuff, which we'll get to in a second. This is all running inside of a code block that says Meteor is server. So all of this code inside of here only runs on the server. This is the first export function, which is like, we use the ES 2016 syntax, so 15 syntax. So exporting is how you sort of elevate. If you're used to Node, it's sort of the module.exports function. That's sort of the same thing. And this is all just definition for making a new URL that has a blank set of values that we need. And then this Meteor methods is definition of stuff that you can do to URLs. So this URLs.bulk insert, URLs.insert, .set priority. These are all actual methods. Meteor asks that you sort of namespace them with this dot thing. I'm not a massive fan of that, but it is what it is. So we roll along with that. And so this is where you can see all of the actual sort of actions that the app can take. So this is the URL locking mechanism. When somebody checks out a URL inside of the app, it's run by this URLs.lock. And then .unlock is obviously the converse of that. And then we've got merge and unmerge, which actually should be deleted because that feature is deprecated. Set private is making a URL private. And then, yeah, so like this is sort of the general gist, and you'll see this pattern time and time again, where we do a whole bunch of these publish functions, which again, I'll talk about in a second. Oh, it's not edit our code. And then we define methods. And then the biggest thing that each of these files do is they export a Mongo collection. And so this is sort of like every single one of these API files, the sort of final like output of each file is this Mongo collection of the actual URLs. And so, yeah, it's important to realize that in Meteor, Mongo collections operate on both the client and the server. So we have that in both ends, and that's just worth thinking about. On the client side, it's actually simulated. There's like a Mongo simulation thing that emulates the effects of doing Mongo queries. So you'll see some of that if you ever end up running into exceptions on the client side. It'll be like, simulation exception, which is basically saying, hey, we tried to pretend this query was being run on the client side, but it didn't work. One of the huge advantages of the Meteor framework is it does a ton of client-side caching. And so it actually sort of pretends that there is a Mongo database inside of the user's browser. I think it leverages local storage. I haven't actually bothered to check how it does that, but I'm pretty sure that's how it accomplishes its tasks, which makes it also makes the synchronization sort of for updates and changes really, really nice. Okay. So,
quick question. So this new Mongo collections URLs, that's a collection. So that is like a table of URLs. It's not one URL, right?
Exactly. So Mongo uses the word collection in place of table. It's also worth noting that in Mongo, collections can contain like any number of nesting of objects, so you can put objects inside of objects instead of your usual sort of Postgres style. And that's one of the big sort of Mongo things. So, and while we're at it, let's talk about this completely separate subject, which is the Meteor publish function. This is actually how we define stuff that feeds that the client can subscribe to. So all of Meteor is based on a pub sub model. So users, when they navigate to certain parts of the app, they actually end up subscribing to changes on specific feeds. And this is where we actually publish those feeds that they can sort of see. And so this is important because this is where the server actually determines what is permitted to be subscribed to. So if we wanted to sort of keep something confidential, keep something server side, this is actually where we would define it. If you filter things out of the results, the return results here. So like if we said return, I can actually show that in the users tab because we don't expose, like here we're publishing, just give me a sec. Here we're publishing a list of users, but obviously we don't want to publish their passwords or anything. So we publish with a fields record inside of the users, which actually scopes down the number of things that can be returned when someone subscribes to the user list feed. And I'll show you where subscriptions happen. That happens at the UI layer inside of containers. But just so to get a sort of initial lay of the land, Meteor.publish is the big way that the server sort of lets people subscribe to these change feeds. Where was our URLs? So yeah, and you'll notice we publish a lot of different URL feeds. These are all the different phases inside of the app. And in here, you'll notice that we're calling to this phase selector thing. It's a very common pattern in that I've sort of inherited from the Redux framework to try and do computation on state inside of their own, like to isolate that stuff. So this phase selector function gets defined in this selectors thing that I told you should probably get elevated, which is UI selectors URL. And so here we actually define, this is the phase selector function. And we talk about like how to actually select from the total canonical list of URLs, what a crawlable URL looks like. So this is saying, if it's a URL that has a crawlable field and that crawlable field is a Boolean value set to true, that will filter. That's a filter that would return yes for that field, right? And so the research phase, same thing. So it's sort of saying, hey, we got to have the research done, sort of checked off as false because we want to see something inside of the research phase. If the URL is marked as crawlable as false and merged as undefined because this is carryover from old deprecated code. yeah, this is sort of how we do it. But you'll see this all over the place. Like we basically try to centralize the phase selector function so that anytime you're looking for the merged URLs list, you just call this phase selector thing, and that gives you back the actual thing to feed to Mongo. So over here, you can see we're looking for a phase selector of harvest type to represent the harvest feed. There's lots of reading on the Mongo stuff. A lot of this is probably starting to come a little quick. Like how to do this, like urls.find method is a Mongo method. And so you can read about that on the MongoDB documentation. You'll see stuff like find one. You'll see stuff like update. That's inside of our methods. You know, we've got URLs, we've got insert, update. These are all database calls, and they're sort of wrapped inside of these checks. So if we want to insert a URL, this check is a validation function. Obviously, we need to do a little more validation work. And then we sort of normalize the URL. We try to make sure it doesn't exist already in the database, and then make sure that there's a user logged in. And then if all that passes, we sort of do the insert. So it's sort of the general feel. You'll see this like URLs dot. This is working with Mongo stuff. And all of these methods are sort of the only way that you should ever be interacting with the database from the UI layer. Okay, quick pause. How are we feeling so far?
Yeah, pretty good. One thing that I have found, John, there is a Mongo command line interface, a shell you can get into from your wherever machine you're running the app. And it's kind of if you're used to relational databases, it just has its own sort of query language, which feels more like JavaScript than SQL essentially. But you can at the very least, it's been useful because I have a local copy of the app running with just a few URLs and a few users, so I can just kind of concat them all out to the screen and just sort of see what's in the back end.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Stuff is looking right.
Yes, and then I actually did end up using that shell a lot because currently we're sort of lacking certain functionalities in the app that I end up using the shell to just manually manipulate the database. Right. So yeah, not the greatest, but it's sort of how we're getting by right now. And so yeah, very good point. Okay, so. Okay, so that's basically the API folder. It's worth sort of like sitting down and reading through all of the API stuff if you're going to sort of manipulate anything. Sort of the beating heart of the app. The API folder is where it's all made and broken. And so, but obviously, if you want to manipulate stuff, you got to be able to see it. So that's where our UI folder comes in, and this is where everything gets super React.js oriented. So anything inside the UI folder, if it's sort of like got some syntax that you're confused by, or it looks strange and mutant, because let's give you a feel for some of this. A container is a good place to start. Let's start with the app one. We have this is React code like du jour, where you see these HTML tags actually mixed in with JavaScript. So yeah, if you want to read more about how the components or the UI folder works, that I'd recommend reading a ton about React. It's sort of a great way to get acquainted with this code base. If any of this feels foreign or scary or weird, feel free to just leave it until it doesn't. There's a lot to learn about sort of the React way of doing things. It is, I think it's like hands down the most functional way to work on front end stuff. You can see how some of these components end up tying together. I think it's a really fun framework to work in.
So it's run through some kind of preprocessor? Is that what React is?
Oh yeah. So okay. So actually, it's worth doing a 10,000-foot view of React right now. So React emerged. It's a Facebook technology. It came out as a effort to improve on the DOM rendering speed, and it also was trying to solve a lot of these issues of like large-scale front-end apps. And so React introduces two really big concepts. They introduce the concept of a component, which is sort of their like fundamental unit. Components are intended to be composed together to form stuff. A good example of components are, we have like a modal component, which is like literally a modal dialogue. And then we've got like a spinner, which is our loading. So like literally right now our spinner is just literally the text loading in a div, which probably could be improved. But that's...
routes that you showed earlier, they essentially map to components, right? And then other
Exactly.
components, you know, it's kind of top level components, which then call sort of more atomic components to do their thing.
Yeah, and the most important thing to realize about the way React works is it is expected that the programmer can call render a lot. This is most front-end frameworks, you tend to think about rendering as a fairly expensive function and like very time-consuming, and so you try to sort of minimize the number of times you call it. The way that React does this is they've actually sort of modified this framework. I apologize if you're hearing a siren. I can't tell you. We're recording the call. But what's this saying? Okay, so calling render is, there's actually a diffing algorithm underneath the hood that avoids touching the DOM. And so when you call render in React, it produces this giant, in JavaScript, object tree that represents the way the DOM should look. And then it looks at the way the DOM actually looks, it looks at the way the DOM is actually sort of structured at that point in time. And instead of changing the entire DOM, which is really slow, it only makes modifications to the point. It actually produces a diff of what the DOM is and what the new render function wants, and it only applies the diff. And it is just brilliant in the way that it gets around the slowness of the DOM. That's the way that it used to work. There is actually a new algorithm in React 15, I think, called Fibers, and so it actually works a little different than that. But it's worth just thinking about it that way. So you'll see render get called a ton because render can actually end up being a no-op, right? You can call it, and the diff that gets produced could actually end up being nothing, and it'll just do nothing, which is a very like desirable property for for people doing UI work, because now you can call render as many times as you need. And you no longer have to worry about sort of synchronizing the state at render time. It just says, no, let's always just determine what state is and call render. And so you see that sort of loop happening time and time again. And state is very, very, very explicitly handled inside of React. We only really have two ways of plumbing changes to a component into a component, and that's via something called props, which are properties, or state, which is contained state within the component that lets you modify stuff like, hey, is this checkbox checked? You know, that's a state. But you could also just as easily send a checked property to that component and have that sort of plumbed in and represented. And I'll show you examples of that. But yeah, let's start with okay. And the final thing, on top of React, a lot of frameworks, React is only a view layer framework, so it only deals with the notion of components and the notion of rendering stuff to the DOM. There's no, React doesn't have anything to say about the way you store your information or how you even handle sort of like updating or changing actions throughout the app. So that is all, Meteor does have some opinions about that, however. And so those opinions end up getting pulled in as in this distinction between containers and components. And so a component it can be thought about as a dumb, it doesn't have any knowledge about sort of like how to talk to the underlying Mongo sort of data. So if you look at all these components, they're just like really, they should be incredibly dry, right? This like all components always have to define only one function called render. And it takes no arguments and has to return this sort of like JSX syntax stuff. You cannot return undefined from a render function. Well, you can. There are some exceptions, but anyways. The point here is everything in the components folder these are really dumb components. They shouldn't sort of like do anything too complicated. They should basically just be these sort of like representation of how to work with of how to represent something on the screen. So an agency item is an item inside of a list. So it's a table row that just shows this is literally how do we represent how do we represent a single agency in a list. Forms are what you'd expect. Forms are a little more interesting because you actually have to handle interaction. And so we handle interaction by defining these custom functions like handle submit, which is the actual submit call. And we hook that up via this sort of on submit right here. So we'd say we have to do some funky binding nonsense because of the way that JavaScript works, but suffice it to say, inside of our returned final component, we have this onSubmit, which connects to the handle submit function, which is here. The first thing we do is prevent default because we don't want to actually submit the HTML form. We're going to do it all the React way. And then here you're seeing that this component calls a passed in property, which is a function. And the property that's passed in is called onSubmit. And then we hand up the data from this component. And basically what this is saying is I'm a really dumb component. All I do is when somebody clicks the submit button, I wrap up all my data, which is contained in state, and I pass it along to whatever that function that I was passed in the first place. So if you look down in the prop types definition, we see that this is sort of a, prop types is a way of listing everything that this component expects to be passed. So you'll notice here we have the onSubmit, and it's saying this is a prop type of function and it's required. So if you don't give me a prop called onSubmit and it's not a function, or if you give me something called in onSubmit that isn't a function, I am going to crash. So these checks only happen at dev time. At runtime, these are all taken out, and so the program will just actually it'll try to just roll with whatever you give it. But while we're working at dev time, this thing, if you were to like try to do like agency form and not pass it, and you do onSubmit equals, and we just actually explicitly pass undefined in here, this would crash the program. But if we passed in a function and we actually did something with it, that would be valid. Or at least it would pass validation. Because it doesn't do anything, it wouldn't work very well.
It's parsed by the React preprocessor.
Exactly, yeah. And so just so you know, like all of these calls to React's preprocessor will render this out as these are all function calls in React land. So this, when it actually gets preprocessed to, what is it? React.dom.div, a function call, and then it'll have you'll get passed. Yeah, basically, so that it actually creates this giant JavaScript object, and that ends up being the return value. So it'll be a call to form, and then the form would get past all of this stuff. And that's all handled by the preprocessor. We don't ever touch that stuff because it ends up getting way too messy. But yeah, so following so far, how are we feeling?
Yeah, I'm okay. I think I'm doing as well as I can. I've not seen React before.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in at once. And it's about to get just a touch more complicated. But so the biggest thing, the last sort of thing to explain is how we actually connect Mongo data or sort of like state into, how do we plumb that into the app? And that's where containers jump in. And so a container is just a component, but it's wrapped in a special function that connects data from the database to the React app itself. And so let's start with the app. So this is a pretty important distinction, right? The containers are much, quote unquote, smarter than the components. So it's expected that if you look at the top level of, like if we look at our router on the client, oh yeah, it is in startup. If we look at our routes, almost all of these routes are importing containers. So this is all coming from the UI containers folder, right? Like app, this is how app gets dragged into the actual routing. So the top level route, so which is just like literally the slash, which is like the empty bit, that gets past the app container. And so we can look at the app container here, and this is where it actually it's got this special function called create container. And this is where we take a component called app, which we've defined here. This is defined in a special way. This is called a stateless function component. That basically, this is the exact same thing as class app extends React.component with a render func. But instead, if you don't have any state and you don't have any handlers, you can actually just make a function and return it. And React looks at this as the same thing as just like one call to render. So we have this function or this component app, and we're now going to pass it into this create container function here. And what we're going to do is this create container function is the place where we actually get to talk to the database and bring stuff into our React components. So whatever we return from here, from this create container, gets passed to the app as the props, as the prop stuff. So let's give you a better example than that. So dashboard's actually a great start. So like in dashboards, oh, it's also functionless. Sorry, I've been refactoring a lot of stuff. I need to find an easier, here we go. Login, let's use login. Because it looks a little more like our classic, we've got the handlers. These are all the places where we actually handle the functions. And you notice that the containers, like handle submit function actually does stuff, right? Like this is actually a call to Meteor's login with password function. So the containers do a lot more sort of like talking to the actual backend, and they're expected to be the sort of intelligent places where the more complicated stuff happens. So if we look at this create container function, so what we're doing here is we're passing in the login component, which we've declared here, which is a much more classic React component. And the first thing, so you can see that login's prop types expects a prop of current user, and it expects it to be an object. And so the question is, how do we get the current user into the login screen? And so what the current user is for is it's a check to see if someone visits login and they're already logged in, right? If the current user already exists, we want to redirect them. And so that's where this says, if user is logged in, so inside of our render function, if we ever actually get a prop called current user, we push them to their own profile so that they don't actually see the login screen if they're already logged in. And that's how that works. And then we return the spinner from that because we don't actually want to render out the full login screen ever in that case. So the way we actually do the connection is here in this create container function, we have this meteor.user, and this is where we pull the user out of Meteor, and then we pass it to the component as a prop. So you notice this is some special fancy syntax in ES 2015. All this means is this.props is currently an object, is this, basically. This is what is here. So we're returning props. So props is an object, and then this thing that you're seeing here is called destructuring. So we're just saying we expect props is an object that looks like this and has a value that's an object. This would be like user name, and all this stuff would be in here, right? This is the actual data. So whenever you see this const current user, this is called destructuring. So we're just pulling the current user value out of the props object. And so we're doing the same thing with state here. So we have a state object, and we're pulling username, password, and error. These are the actual values for the fields. And so you'll see the form fields here where we've got form.
And that syntax, that's doing it based on the property name, I think, right? So
yes, exactly. Yeah.
So basically, you don't have to enumerate every single property. They don't have to be in the exact same order as they are coming out of the return function.
Exactly. Yeah. And not only that, you can assign defaults to these things. So if you can say username equals, default username, and this is valid as well. Yeah. So, which is kind of nice. It's nice to be able to basically just to like deal with that. You used to run into this constant problem writing JavaScript where you go, okay, var username equals this dot state dot username, right? This code ended up being very terse, and so that's where they came up with the destructuring. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. And to your point, Kevin, it's also worth noting that you don't have to pull everything out. You can just pull the things you want out.
Yeah, I figured that out through while I was thinking, that I made a change and it still worked. I'm like, all right, this is, there's a kind of a similar sort of list syntax that you come across in PHP, but it's not as flexible as this. So
totally.
Cool.
I noticed that before too, because I think it's been adopted pretty quickly. Because like you said, I think it's very useful. Yeah,
it cuts down on a lot of the like irritating boilerplate of JS. If you want to learn more about this stuff, it's babel.js.io. That's the place to check. Definitely worth a read. That'll explain everything about ES 2015 syntax. And there's some weird stuff, right? Like this, like destructuring is a bit strange. The defaults now, because now you can hand defaults to functions, so I can actually do name equals, stuff. That's permitted.
The defaults thing I did not know.
Yeah, and like we can do this kind of stuff where we can do values as keys by using or what looks like the array syntax. But what this is saying is take whatever the variable name is and make its value the key for this object. So there's a whole bunch of like little, and then we also have arrow functions. I don't know if you guys have seen those.
Yeah, that was the first thing actually that I saw that was unfamiliar.
Yeah, this is. Yeah, and are you familiar with, how are you guys feeling about this and handling context in JavaScript?
I think I personally, it's kind of in my like, I'm kind of an abstract person, so I think I'm kind of okay with.
Yeah, it's good to hear, because it can be very frustrating, right?
Yeah.
Like
so
all of these.
When I read about the arrow thing, I mean, essentially kind of creating an anonymous function, but allowing you to be scoped, to maintain the variables that are scoped outside of it. Right?
Exactly.
I was like, I haven't done a ton of JavaScript compared to folks who work, all the time in these kinds of frameworks, but but I've come across that problem before.
Okay.
So immediately I was like, okay, I see what they're trying to do here, and it's good.
Yeah, it's a nice little trick. You can run into problems with it, because it can get a little confusing if you're not used to juggling this value. It's also worth noting that it doesn't carry much beyond this value. Like if you declare a variable, like here currently we have in this scope, we have username, password, and error pulled out as constants in this state. If we did this and talked about username in here, it would obviously absorb. It would, if you declared a new username value, this would shadow the variable from above, right? So this, username here would be fave. And if we obviously didn't declare this would be username here would be the outside scope, but that would also be true of a function. So a plain old function, blah, it'd be the same thing. The only thing that the fat arrow syntax affects is this, right? The phrase this. So if you call a raw function inside of this context, it may or may not be called in the context, depending on where you call this. A raw function call, like if we were to just immediately call this, this could end up being bound to window instead of being bound, which is really irritating. And that's where the fat arrow syntax is really helpful. Because right now, if I were to say like this dot state here, that's bound to the component, right? And that's what we want. So React under the hood comes in and sees the render function and goes, you probably want to call that in the context of this component. So when you talk about this dot state inside of the render func, React has sort of handled that for you. Now, React doesn't know anything about sorry, let me clean this up. Doesn't know anything about our handle submit calls, right? Because these are custom functions that we're defining, or methods that we're defining. So we have to actually manually bind those in our event handlers. And so that's why you see this bind this. And then this is one of my favorite tricks, because if we're calling bind, we can actually do something called function pre-binding. And so what we're doing here is, so this is the return value of all of this is the function handle change bound to the context of this. But since we're returning a function and not actually calling it, we can pre-bind an argument to that function. So the handle change, if we look up at handle change, its function signature expects a name and then the event, the actual event object, which is would be a DOM click event. In most cases, in this case, it would actually be a change event from the DOM. So this name, without this, we leverage this function pre-binding. So we're actually passing in one of the arguments before we've even called the function. And so when somebody actually invokes this bound function with the event, what gets passed to handle change is actually username and then the event. And so where this really cleans stuff up is this avoids us having to do stuff like handle username change in the event, right? So we don't have to have separate ones for each. We can just pre-bind the field that we're talking about. And so you'll see this constantly in the code where it's like the value should be the username that we've pulled out of state here. And when we change it, we want it to affect the username field of state, right? So it's kind of janky and it's a little tough to get your head around, but once you understand function pre-binding, it's a super powerful concept that can save a lot of boilerplate. So yeah, how are we feeling about that?
Yeah, that's okay. I've done a little bit with the functional programming, so it comes up to, I think they call it partial application or something.
Absolutely, yeah. Partial application. It's related to the notion of currying, but it's partial.
Currying, that's what it's called, right? Currying. Yeah. Exactly.
It's not. This isn't technically currying, but this is partial application of partially applying a function. The only reason we call it pre-binding is because we're actually using it in the context of calling bind, which actually connects us to state or to our current context.
And I think it's really nice that you're reminding me of this stuff, because like I've worked with this and stuff, but it's always a little confusing. It's nice. It's definitely nice to go over it.
Well, it's nice to be useful then. That's great to hear. Yeah. So I mean, moving right along, I think that's kind of the general gist of things. Like, it's worth noting that every one of these containers expects to have the create. Like, you'll always have the create container function at the bottom. You can always expect to see, oh yes, and then finally to connect that final dot, you see this is where we actually do the subscribe, and so this is where Meteor does its magic, and we say we want to subscribe to changes to the events feed. So in our API folder, we declared we published a feed called events, which is just a list of all the events, and without any changes or anything. Clearly, we're making some work when private events happen. And then inside of our container, wow, node modules, you're a big folder. Inside of our event container, we're actually subscribing to changes on that. So what this effectively does behind the scenes is, now that we've called subscribe on events, this Meteor will use a WebSocket connection to the database, and anytime Mongo publishes a change to the events feed, this will actually connect to the Meteor will get a notification of that, will recall render with all of the new values, and will update all of the state automatically. And so this is how we get the magic, when one user changes one thing, it changes across the board for every user. And so I think it's a really beautiful sort of set of tricks. You'll notice that the first thing in our create container functions we do is we always do all of our event subscriptions first, because all of these sort of like find one event. So this is where we're actually like pulling this database and like setting up the actual props that we're going to return. Are we in Babel syntax? Yes, we are. So it's I don't know. I think it's super fun. It's a slick system where render is going to get called on its own. Like, you'll notice that our code doesn't have any direct calls to render, right? Like, rendering is being handled by Meteor, and it's being handled in reaction to changes to state on the server side, or changes that the user is initiating inside of our handle function.
In a high level, you're telling Meteor like what objects you want where, and then it handles updating them when they actually get updated. Is that exactly? So inside of our events, so right now the model container, and so we only subscribe to the events feed. So this way, changes to URLs we don't get notified about, right? And Meteor handles the unsubscribing for us, which I think is like insanely magical, and maybe too magical, but it's not Meteor, so that's React.
Yeah. Now React, this is more Meteor sort of like auto magic nonsense, but whatever. And so like you'll notice on the invite, we only subscribe to the invites sort of feed. So I think it's a slick sort of like way of delineating what a current. So if a user is currently looking at the invite prop or invite component, that's when we actually create all our subscriptions, and so they all get torn down every time somebody navigates away from a page. So how is this feeling, Kevin? You feeling acquainted?
Yeah, pretty well. I mean, I've kind of yesterday was the first time that I really opened up the code to try to start changing things. And so, I kind of figured out sort of half of this, and then, kind of the other things, the sort of the exports and the,
Oh, can't hear you. Hold on. You're breaking up, Kevin. Hello? No. No, can't hear you still. Not sure. But yeah, I'll let you sort that out.
Yeah, I also I feel like I mean obviously I don't. There's a lot I don't know, but I mean it's definitely been very helpful, both in terms of sort of the overview of the things and the organization here.
Oh, that's, yeah. I think that working through the folder structure is like a big, there's a lot to understand there, and just like where stuff goes.
The organization of like what's going forward and what is that? So there's like like a Kanban board or something? How does that work with figuring out how to proceed, or are we gonna do that? Like, I guess there's a Tuesday meeting usually, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the big sort of like what, and Kevin's been working on this amazing issue queue, which is, I'll paste that into chat, but that's actually hosted on the Edgy GitHub. And that's, yeah, I'll send it to you after, but basically that's where all of the current sort of work to be done on the app is listed. Yeah, so I think that's it. I guess it's worth noting that SCSS is our CSS framework, so we leverage that a little bit. I've actually gone to the trouble of like pulling Bootstrap out of, like, we manually sort of generate Bootstrap every time. This way we can sort of like manipulate stuff like the variables folder inside of Bootstrap is actually like custom handled by us. We're able to manipulate some of these values so that we don't sort of have to talk on top of Bootstrap.
Okay.
I think that's a little better, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what, nothing visible changed here. But.
Well, it sounds great now. Yeah, and so like this, inside of this Bootstrap folder, inside of this CSS folder, we have the actual definition of some components here. So like we have like, and I also define a couple of like conventions, like this list.page. You'll see this a lot if we go to components and we go to actually containers, list containers. So each container declares, the way it inherits a lot of its style is from this list page class name. And so here we're sort of saying this is generally how a page list should look. And so like page has a whole bunch of stuff. So just we take the raw page handler, and then, or not handler, page class. And that's how this is sort of like general description of how a page should look. Great. And then a list page should have, these extra additions. And so it's just a more flexible way of dealing with the CSS. So everything to make a page look proper, usually all you have to do is add page. And then if it's a list, we just add list. And then if we want to do further customization, we would declare a new file called events somewhere in this folder. And we'd actually do all of our stuff off the ID. So it would be like, to give you a feel for that, that would look like this. Events, and then we'd do all of our event stuff in here, and we'd save that in the SCSS folder. Yeah, I think that's kind of it. Feeling good? Feeling great?
Yeah, I think so. I think that was really nice.
So so a couple questions. It would be great to get a QA environment set up.
Yes.
So that we can kind of stage changes. And then the other question is just about getting, sort of test data, into that environment or down into local environments, just so that we can deal with things like, I noticed that there's, the URLs page just kind of caps out at 200, and there's a little bit of code in there sort of sketching out possibly doing a load more or,
Yeah.
So, just being able to work on that without having to make 200 URLs, that kind of thing.
Totally. Yeah, there is a script to pull from production in the private import, but I obviously for security reasons haven't published the database access URL.
Sure.
But what we can do at bare minimum is just get a dump of old staging data, which I think is probably the best to work with, because that means that you're actually seeing like real information full of errors and craziness.
Sure.
And so, yeah, we'll definitely, that's one thing we should do. Obviously that will contain passwords and user information. So we'll have to figure out a way to sort of anonymize that. I'll sort of see if I can't publish a proper data set that we can use as like the Mongo import command. There is also there should be a sync. Oh no, I don't think I actually put that in the folder. Yeah, because I was worried about that stuff. There's some sort of, stuff that is worth protecting security wise, but from the CI perspective, I couldn't agree more. Having some sort of, I think I'm going to get you guys access to the staging environment actually on Heroku. So if you want, you can sort of push to it and just zap the database whenever needed. I think that'll probably be one of the easiest ways for all of us to sort of grind on changes. And then continuous integration, we really should be, once we have a proper test. You notice I didn't cover tests at all because there aren't any.
I was thinking of asking.
And so we talked with Dan a little bit this morning. There's some thinking that we'll actually try and tackle that in the near future. I do want to sort of say, we do have a lot of brand new tech coming out next week. And one of the big things on the roadmap will be taking a lot of this code. And so this weekend we had 6 events and I had to spin up 7 servers to sort of just to handle the load. And we were maxing the RAM on all of those servers for a lot of time. And so like 7 boxes for, I think what is basically 600, maximum 600 people using the app at any given point that's just too much. And I think the issue is that Meteor just eats RAM like it's, potato chips. So I think what I would like to think about for next week is actually taking our Archivers front end that's written in React, that I think the React code is great. And I may actually write a custom backend for it that just talks to the WebSockets work with the next iteration.
If there's not a huge investment in the media part, I definitely see that like having people's clients update in real time is not necessarily the most important thing, especially if it's getting servers getting bogged down, for example.
Actually at these events it is very important because that's what keeps people from stepping on each other's toes. It's the actual like mutex locks of somebody checking out is really important. That's like something that we learned the hard way when we were working off of Google Sheets. So we do need something, but we really only need it for that lock unlock feature, right? Yeah. Everything else, and one of the huge issues that you'll notice with Meteor when you start to get working through this like live data stuff is like pagination is just a nightmare, right? Because if you think about it, the reason, and Kevin, to your point, the reason that we only load 200 URLs and the like load more stuff that I started grinding on, you can understand how like Meteor publishes a change has been made, but it has no idea what subset of the URL list you're looking at. And so it just gets really irritated and confused when you start doing paginated work. So right now, the current workaround is just to show you, hey, there's 200 and some URLs, and then we give you search so that you can grind down into actual specific URLs. So moving forward, I think it would be much more ideal to have stuff like URLs not delivered over the Meteor subscription sort of style, and instead publish that in the classic sense of like, hey, you're talking directly to a database, and we'll paginate it the normal way, and we won't sort of eat up all this memory trying to serve you change feeds of thousands of URLs. And instead, we'll only save that memory for a WebSocket connection that explains, hey, this person is currently working on this URL. And so we'll always have that sort of WebSocket oriented. We can push updates to you and saying, hey, somebody changed this file. And so we'll still have that on the one-to-one when you're looking at an individual model. This stuff, I think, Meteor is just choking. Partially because we're not using it to its fullest capacity, that's for sure. But just thinking about the like long-term need of the project, where we're going to start to load many more URLs into the app once we go to a one-to-one relationship. And so I think Meteor starts to become a tougher fit when it's like, no, we're actually going to need to jam like 2,000 to 5,000 entries down to a client and have that just sort of stay there. So there's lots to think about there. But so just before anybody goes crazy being like, hey, I'm going to like, pour 10 weeks of my life into this thing, we have some changes coming down the pipe that would be worth thinking about before we do that. Already though, I mean, I think today it was so worth going through and like linting all of that code and like having a good look at it. I think it really ups the chances that we'll sort of carry a lot of those components forward into our new stuff. So I'm super pumped about it. I think the project's headed in a great direction, particularly all of the issues that we're seeing show up on our public repo, I think is really nice just to get good UX insights into what is and isn't confusing people. Like that knowledge we will absolutely use moving forward. And so if we can ship fixes to that stuff sooner, awesome. But if we can't, I'm okay with catching a lot of that on this like version 2 stuff once we sort of put it to the community, get some feedback, and understand where the long-term direction of the app is. Does that sound good to you guys?
Yeah, I have a question. So I was slightly afield, but I was one of the people who were kind of thinking that some of the stuff is not so much the UI, the URL, stuff, because that has to be, has to have an app telling people what to look at, but like the actual like coding, scraping stuff could be done in a wiki. I don't know if have people talked about that yet at all, or there's so much stuff to think about, so that it's kind of. We don't have to talk about it now, though. Maybe it's better brought up on Tuesday, you think?
It will get brought up on Tuesday. A lot of the people from MIT are taking on a lot of that project of actually wikiing out how to work with specific styles of scraping.
Yeah, I'm affiliated with them.
Oh, right. Are you at MIT right now?
No.
Okay. Yeah, and so Jeff Liu at MIT is, and him and a guy named Max, who I haven't met properly yet, but is wonderful. Are sort of really taking the initiative on that. We've been having some chats with Dan Allen, who has floated the wonderful idea of potentially running all of this in a sort of cron-based continuous integration style environment where we would ship the code for scraping, like tough to scrape stuff, in a specific format so that we can actually just automate its execution.
I think that would work really well if we could.
Yeah.
I think that would be brilliant.
Yeah, and I think it'd be really fun because that'll mean that we can that'll save a really great space for people to contribute awesome usable code at these events where developers can show up and write these, difficult to scrape scripts and know that it'll get used and rerun. And like, I think that'd be super helpful for us, and it would be a fun challenge for people looking to work on a tough problem. So yeah, I think that's the hope. We don't have a full plan in place for that yet, but that's sort of what we're thinking about as a long-term solution for tough to scrape content.
Okay. Yeah, I'm definitely going to try to go to Tuesday.
Yeah, if you can, it's well worth it.
Hopefully talk about that because I do have thoughts, but yeah. But this has been great. I mean, I obviously the pipelining app is essential to figuring out how people decide where to put
stuff.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, totally. Cool. Well, it looks like Kevin's dropped off the call, so I think we'll probably wrap it up here if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
And thanks so much for joining, John. And
thank you.
And we'll let me know if you have any questions moving forward.
Will do.
All right. Chat soon.
Bye.